Welcome to our website, and thank you for watching this video on the foundation of freedom. This is the second in a series of videos, and in this video we will be covering the subject of freedom, sovereignty, and justice. And here is an outline of what we're going to talk about. Introduction to the civil law, legal implications of equality, the meaning of sovereignty, sovereignty and delegated powers, government religion through inequality, waivers of sovereign immunity and loss of equality, avoiding franchises, and preventing inequality administratively. So let's begin. Introduction to the civil law. Civil statutory law is the means of regulating and controlling your public conduct. Not all your conduct, just your public conduct. And by public conduct we mean conduct as an agent or officer of the public, called a citizen or a resident. The foundation of the civil statutory law is the requirement for your consent, and civil statutory law implements what is called the social compact. All compacts are contracts or agreements between parties, and to be the subject of the social compact you have to volunteer. Those who volunteer are called citizens if they were born in the country, and residents if they were born in another country. In that sense, civil societies behave as the equivalent of a club, and you have to join the club in order to be subject to the club rules. And the club rules are called civil statutory law. And joining the club is done by calling yourself a citizen or resident on a government form. If you would like further information on this subject of the civil law, we refer you to Why Statutory Civil Law is Law for Government and Not Private Persons, Form 05.037 on our website, and Why Domicile and Becoming a Taxpayer Require Your Consent, Form 05.003. And here is how you agree to the social compact or contract as described by a Texas court in 1922. The rights of the individual are not derived from governmental agencies, either municipal, state, or federal, or even from the Constitution. They exist inherently in every man by endowment of the Creator and are merely reaffirmed in the Constitution and restricted only to the extent that they have been voluntarily surrendered by the citizenship, and notice we say domicile, not nationality, to the agencies of government. So choosing a domicile or a residence is how you surrender or join the clubs or surrender your equality. The people's rights are not derived from the government, but the government's authority comes from the people. The Constitution but states again these rights already existing, and when legislative encroachment by the nation, state, or municipality invade these original and permanent rights, it is the duty of the courts to so declare and to afford the necessary relief. The fewer restrictions that surround the individual liberties of the citizen, except those for the preservation of public health, safety, and morals, the more contented the people and the more successful the democracy. And we want to clarify those terms. There's a distinction between having a domicile and having a nationality in a place. You can be a member of a nation called a national by being born or naturalized there, and yet not have a domicile there and being a non-resident under the statutory law. That is the distinction, an important distinction, that allows you to retain your sovereignty and not leave the country. Those who are not party to the civil law and who have not chosen a domicile or residence within a specific jurisdiction or venue are called non-residents. The act of consenting is called choosing a domicile or residence. The acting of consenting to the civil law and becoming a statutory citizen or resident is a First Amendment choice of political association that no one can compel you to make. Why? Because you're essentially contracting with a group of people called a state to join the state. And governments are established to protect your right to contract. And inherent in every right is the right to not engage in the activity. If you have a right to contract, you also have a right, protected right, to not contract under the First Amendment and under the Constitution, Article 1, Section 10. Those who don't consent to the social compact or the civil law are called non-residents or transient foreigners, and those who are non-residents are still protected by the Constitution and the common law, but may not avail themselves of the, quote, benefits and privileges, close quote, of the civil law. So in that sense, the civil law behaves as a protection franchise. You have to join the franchise. You have to, by calling yourself a citizen or a resident, before you can enjoy the benefits of the franchise. And consonant with joining is the obligation of allegiance and paying for the protection that you're getting. So, what do other people say about this concept? These basic concepts behind the civil law are not unique or new. The concept of domicile is behind them all. Most legal neophytes and freedom fighters misunderstand these concepts by making the following false statements. For instance, that all law is voluntary, both civil and criminal, which isn't true. That criminal law is voluntary, it is not. That you can unvolunteer without changing your behavior or your status in the government's records. Instead, you need legal evidence to document your withdrawal of consent. And finally, the last false statement is that they can have any kind of resident ID, such as a driver's license, and yet not be a statutory person, individual, or citizen. The walk has to match the talk. If you want to be a non-resident, it has to be reflected in the government's records, and you have to have evidence that you did that, and you have to behave consistently with that decision in every interaction with any government. So don't be one of these people who are spreading false information about the civil law and civil jurisdiction. Now let's hear how their other simplistic legal neophytes misrepresent these civil law concepts. And we're going to show you a short video on that subject. The video is from Ben Lowry, and his assertion is that the law is voluntary. He argues that there is no universally applicable rule, and in fact there is. It's called the criminal law. He sees society as a club or a compact, but in fact the civil law is the club or the compact, and he doesn't understand the difference between the civil and the criminal law. And this is a huge mistake.
Hello everybody, it's Ben Lowry here. In this video I'm going to talk about a couple of ideas which are just so important, so fundamental, so crucial that I just wish that more people would understand this. If everybody got this, you know, it would be powerful. People could really wake up, but people need to understand this, okay? Number one, we've been hypnotized with this word law. We've been indoctrinated and trained from a young age to believe that the law, is mandatory, is not optional. You've got no choice. It applies to you whether you like it or not. You've got to do as you're told. It's for the greater good. Don't ask questions, period. That's what we've been taught. We've been hypnotized. Now, there's actually no such thing. It's ridiculous. There's no such thing as a universally applicable rule that you've got to do as you're told and you've got no choice. That's ridiculous. How does that come about? Says who? You've got to wear a seatbelt in your car. Says who? What gave them the authority to tell you what to do? It's ridiculous, okay? Now, here's what a law really is. It's a rule of a society which applies to the members of that society. You know, the citizens, the subjects, the members of society are subject to the rules of society. Just like any membership club, right? If you're a member of the gym, then, you know, there's certain rules. You've got to pay the monthly fee. You've got to abide by the rules. You know, don't run by the swimming pool. Don't eat or drink when you're on the treadmill. And in exchange for that, you get to use the facilities, and that's the fair exchange. It's voluntary. You don't have to be a member. If you decide to leave the gym and you don't want to be a member anymore and you stop paying the fee, they don't come to your house with guns and threaten you and extort the money out of you with physical violence and handcuffs. And no, they just cut off your membership and you no longer get access to the benefits. It's just like, that's how it should be. And that's what a society is. It's a voluntary social contract, just the same as any club. Okay? You surrender certain natural rights and certain natural freedoms. You leave them at the door in order to participate in the society, to get the benefits and the protections that comes from being a member of society. All right? There's like a trade-off. But it's voluntary, and this is what they don't want you to know. This is what people need to understand. This is why I'm recording this video. It's so important for people to understand that the social contract is voluntary. Why should you have to be a member of society, subject to society's rules? It doesn't make sense. And the fact that the government uses physical threat, and guns and handcuffs and violence to extort money out of you, to treat you as if you've got no choice, to treat you as if their rules are mandatory on you whether you like it or not, that's slavery. That's crime. That's extortion. You can't do that. It's not okay. And this is what they do. It would be okay if they just kicked you out of the club, right? It'd be okay if they just revoked the benefits. It would be okay if they said, look, you're not doing as you're told. You're not abiding by the law. You haven't been paying your taxes. Fuck off. Just get out. You're not getting the benefits anymore. We're not protecting you. You're not getting limited liability commerce and use of the banking system and use of the hospitals and the police. Fuck off. That would be alright, just revoking the benefit, because that's what any other membership club would do. But no, here's the difference, and here's what people need to understand, and here's what's wrong, and here's what's not right. They don't just do that. They actually use guns and threats and coercion and extortion and physical violence to intimidate you and extort money out of you as if you're a slave, as if you've got no choice, as if it's not voluntary. They force their will upon you, and is not okay, because you do not have to be a member, a subject, a citizen of a society. You do not have to be subject to that society's rules. It is voluntary. A social contract is voluntary. If you don't want to pay the taxes that end up funding wars, if you don't agree with it, then you shouldn't have to. You don't have to. You don't have to participate. It must be voluntary. We're born equal. Nobody owns you. How can they force you to?
Why governments hate those who are equal or sovereign. It is a fact that governments and politicians hate people who are sovereign or equal because, number one, they can't be governed by the civil statutory law, and number two, they can't be taxed, and number three, according to God, they make governments useless. Corrupt politicians and governments don't like either being useless or worthless, or not having your money to bribe voters with. So obviously they don't like people who have that status, but it is perfectly lawful. And consonant with that status is the notion of sovereignty. Sovereignty, those who are non-residents, those who are not a party to the social compact, are called non-residents, and they are described as having sovereignty. And here's a definition of sovereignty: the supreme, absolute, and uncontrollable power by which any independent state is governed. And by uncontrollable, that simply means that they are beyond the civil jurisdiction of the other party, of whoever that party is. Supreme political authority, paramount control of the Constitution and frame of government and its administration, self-sufficient source of political power from which all specific political powers are derived, the international independence of a state combined with the right and power of regulating its internal affairs without foreign dictation, also a political society or state which is sovereign and independent. And keep in mind that this is a general concept they're describing here. Examples of independent political groups other than governments might include things like families, churches, or your own state that you formed among your neighbors, or in your neighborhood, or a county, or any number of other, a business, a corporation itself is essentially an office within the government. So those are examples of independent sovereignties within their own respective spheres. Sovereignty defined. The requirement for consent is the foundation of all of your sovereignty as a human being. And we cover that in the Requirement for Consent Form 5.003, which you can view on our website for free. Having sovereignty means that no one can compel you in a civil statutory court of law without proving you consented to become a statutory citizen or resident. And as we said earlier, you only become a statutory citizen or resident by choosing a domicile, consensually choosing a domicile within a specific jurisdiction. And the only remedy available that anyone has for your injuries as a person with sovereignty is the common law and equity. And the only way that you can lose rights are to injure the equal rights of other sovereigns and thereby commit a crime. This is the basis for the criminal law. Sovereignty and dependency are mutually exclusive. Confucius said, quote, "The more you want or need, the more the world can hurt you." So if you're a needy person, if you need, quote, benefits, or if you need Social Security, or if you need unemployment compensation, or any number of other government payments, then it would be an oxymoron to describe yourself as having sovereignty, at least in the context of that interaction and all the obligations associated with that interaction. Sovereign people can only remain free if they are educated. They must learn to trust their own judgment and intellect above and beyond what the government or others, especially those in the legal profession, tell them. They take 100% personal responsibility for every aspect of their choices and actions and lives. They are skeptical about what people in governments tell them because they are jealous for their liberties, as Thomas Jefferson said they should be. They do not depend on any government for any kind of handouts. See government-instituted slavery using franchises. They do not submit or sign government forms without defining all the terms on the form to prevent being victimized by the self-serving presumptions of others. They do not depend on or allow others to determine or declare or presume their civil status or their rights, whether it be their citizenship status or their tax status. And that is described in your exclusive right to declare or establish your civil status, Form 13.008 on our website. Therefore, please don't ask us to make determinations about your status, because if you do, you're admitting that you aren't sovereign, and you're giving control of your life to us. We don't want to be your master. We want you to be your own master. You own your life, and we want you to make sure that no one takes that ownership away from you by changing your status, for instance. The origins of sovereignty. In our country, the people, not the government, are the sovereigns, and the government exercises sovereign powers, explicitly delegated to it by the people through a written constitution. And here are some of the things that the U.S. Supreme Court said on that subject. There is no such thing as the power of inherent sovereignty in the government of the United States. In this country, sovereignty resides in the people, and Congress can exercise no power which they have not, by their Constitution, entrusted to it. All else is withheld. And in Perry versus United States, 1935, in the United States, sovereignty resides in the people. The Congress cannot invoke sovereign power of the people to override their will, as thus declared. And Yickwell versus Hopkins, 1886, sovereignty itself is, of course, not subject to the law, for it is the author and the source of law. While sovereign powers are delegated to the government, sovereignty itself remains with the people. So what they just admitted there is that if the people are the sovereign, and the sovereign is not the subject of the law, then the people are not the subject of the law, and the only people left to be the subject of the law are people in the government, because the people make law for the government, and you have to join the government and be subject to the civil law as an officer in the government before that code and that compact is even relevant. And finally, in America, we the people, and not the government that serves them, are the state. They are the people who are owed allegiance, not the government or the public servants, for that matter. In every origins of sovereignty, in every political system, the state, quote unquote, is the origin of all sovereignty. And notice very carefully the definition of state in Black's Law Dictionary. State means a people, not a government, but a people, permanently occupying a fixed territory bound together by common law, habits, and custom into one body politic, exercising through the medium of an organized government independent sovereignty and control over all persons and things within its boundaries, capable of making war and peace, and entering into international relations with other communities on the globe. Now notice the phrase they use here. Okay? They said independent sovereignty and control over all persons and things. And the implication is that if you're not a person, then you're not subject to the sovereignty under the civil law. You have to consent to become a person before you're the subject of the club rules that they pass under the civil law. That is not true of the criminal law. The criminal law does not require your consent, is not required to be a domiciliary or a person or a citizen or a resident. You know, if you go out and you kill somebody, it doesn't matter whether you're a citizen or a resident or whether you're a visitor, you still committed murder and you're still going to jail. Keep that in mind. So in that sense, sovereignty is, the concept of sovereignty is irrelevant to the enforcement of the criminal laws. And the origins of sovereignty are that in a monarchy, the state is the king or queen and not the people, who instead are subjects and not sovereigns. And in an oligarchy, a small group of political leaders are the state and not the people under them, who instead are subjects and not sovereigns. Sovereignty and delegated powers. A government based on the equality in the Declaration of Independence and on delegated powers is a government that derives its powers from a natural source, meaning you as a human being. You are a biological creature and therefore a natural source. And that's why all powers of the government have to be delegated from you as a natural source. And that's why they are not supernatural. And a government of delegated powers has no more rights or authority than the people it serves as human beings. And it must operate in equity against other sovereigns as co-equals, and may not assert superior rights of its own or impute inferior rights to you. And it may not force you into a franchise court where you have inferior rights. If you end up in such a court, they have to dismiss the case and may not presume they have jurisdiction if you are not a franchisee. Because franchises are just a superset of what the civil law is. The civil law is a protection franchise, and all franchises are contracts, and all contracts require consent to acquire what's called the force of law. A government of delegated powers may not lawfully change your civil status without your consent, or infer a status within a franchise agreement that you do not have or cannot lawfully have. Only you can choose your status because that status is how you contract with or associate with others. Governments are established to protect your right to contract and associate. And once again, we cover that concept in your exclusive right to declare or establish your civil status, Form 13.008. And a government of delegated powers may not convert your private property or your labor to a public use, a public purpose, or a public office without your express consent or at least compensation. Another way of saying this is that their job is to protect mainly private rights by keeping what is private separate from what is public. All governments are established mainly to protect private rights. In fact, the first step in that protection is to keep them from being converted to public rights without the consent of the owner. You own yourself and all of your property, and you are the exclusive owner, and you start out as the absolute and exclusive owner, and you aren't required to share that ownership or the control of that property with anyone until you consent to it. That's the whole notion of a republican government, in fact. A government based on delegated powers cannot have any more powers than the sovereign people from whom it was delegated. Common law maxims of law prove this, and here are just a few. What is mine, that is sovereignty, cannot be taken away without my consent, and the power that is, sovereign immunity in this case, which is derived, cannot be greater than that from which it was derived. And no one can do that indirectly which he cannot do directly. And what I cannot do in person, I cannot do through the agency of another. And by agency, they're referring to people who work in the government. You cannot delegate an authority to anyone in the government that you don't have. And the source of that is Bouvier's Maxims of Law, 1856, found on the Family Guardian sister site. Now, an important concept to understand is the relationship between a government of delegated powers and what happens when it refuses to stay within those delegated powers. Any government that asserts any right or authority or power that is superior to a single human being is, in fact, a government that derives its authority from a supernatural source, meaning a source that has superior powers to you as a human being who is the natural. And they're operating at that point that they exceed their delegation order. They're operating as a religion and demanding worship, that is obedience, and they're establishing a religion in violation of the First Amendment, and they're establishing themselves as a pagan god. A god is anything or anyone that has supernatural powers, which claims your allegiance and obedience in the form of worship. And if they have more powers than you and you're the natural, then they have supernatural powers, right? And if it demands money, is demanding tithes to a state-sponsored church at that point. Taxes become tithes if they have more powers than you. Any more powers, under any context. Religion is legally defined as worship, meaning obedience towards superior beings who have supernatural powers. And here's the legal definition from Black's Law Dictionary, 6th edition. Religion: man's relation to divinity, to reverence, to worship, to obedience and submission. Note that key word, submission. A citizen is somebody who has submitted themselves to the body politic, the state. And religion is the same thing. You submit yourself to the group, whatever group that is. Submitted to the mandates and precepts of supernatural or superior beings. In its broadest sense, it includes all forms of belief in the existence of superior beings, exercising power over human beings by volition, imposing rules of conduct, e.g. law, franchises, civil law, and so on, with future rewards and punishments, bond uniting man to God, and a virtue whose purpose is to render God worship, that is obedience, due him. Let's see. So that's what we end up with when a government exceeds the authority of a natural source, meaning you as a human being. If they claim any more rights than you have, then they are establishing religion, they're establishing a title of nobility, and they're acting as a pagan god, and they're forcing you to be a worshiper, and they're turning basically taxes into tithes to their church. For complete details, see Government Establishment of Religion, Form 5.038, Socialism, the New American Civil Religion, 5.016, and Our Government Has Become Idolatry and a False Religion. The above sort of state-sponsored religion is impossible if Christians take the approach that Jesus mandated toward government. And here's what he said in Matthew 20:24 through 28. And when the 10 heard it, they were greatly displeased with the 2 brothers. But Jesus called them to himself and said, You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it, that is, parents patriae, over them, and those who are great exercise authority over them. And by Gentiles he means the unbelievers, the secular people in the society. Yet it shall not be so among you. And he's speaking of Christ followers now, God followers. But whoever desires to become great among you, let him be your servant. And whoever desires to be first among you, let him be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. So, and the principle of government that's established here is that anybody who wants to be a politician is there to serve the people, and hence public servant. That's why they originally called them public servants, but you don't hear that very often, do you? Because they don't want to serve anymore. They want to rule. They want to be pagan lords. And they want to put you in an inferior position. And therein really lies the problem of everything. The origin of all the problems we have, in fact, is the inequality and the religion that they want to be part of. The only type of government that God permits, therefore, is one that serves him and the people, and not the other way around. Any government that establishes itself as a religion in this way is destroying the foundation of the Constitution, which is equal protection and equal treatment. And here is a quote from a case that we mentioned in our first video. No duty rests more imperatively upon the courts than the enforcement of those constitutional provisions intended to secure that equality of rights which is the foundation of free government. And any government that establishes itself by exceeding its delegation order from the people or imputing supernatural powers to itself is firing God as our protector and substituting a man, a king, or a parens patriae in its place, which the Bible forbids. And here's an example from the scripture pointing that out. 1 Samuel 12 and 19. And when you saw that Nahash, king of the Ammonites, came against you, you said to me, No, but a king shall reign over us when the Lord God was your king. And all the people said to Samuel, Pray for your servants to the Lord your God, that we may not die, for we have added to our sins the evil of asking a king for ourselves. So apparently it's a biblical sin to have a king above you. The only king you can nominate is God. The only law that can be superior is God's law. And man's law must be consistent with God's law, and to the extent that it isn't is the extent that we should not submit to it. And as we said earlier, you have to volunteer to be subject to it, the civil law. So in other words, you can't volunteer, and you can't be a citizen, and you can't be a resident, you can't be an inhabitant, you can't be a person under the civil law if the civil law is in conflict with God's law, as a believer at least. And a government that establishes religion in this way is causing Christians to commit the worst sin in the Bible, which is idolatry, and it's violating its delegation order from God, which is the Bible, and should be avoided and resisted. And we prove that in Delegation of Authority Order from God to Christians, Form 13.007 on our website. So, when you waive your equality or your sovereignty, what is that called? When a person forfeits their sovereignty or some portion of their property or interest in property, it's called a waiver of sovereign immunity. Implicit in waivers of sovereign immunity is the consent to be sued in either civil statutory franchise court if you are a statutory person, or the common law court if you're a non-resident. And there's only two things you can be, a resident or a non-resident. A resident is somebody who has chosen a domicile. A non-resident is somebody who didn't submit themselves to the social compact and the civil law, and therefore is a non-resident. Waivers of sovereign immunity are described in 28 U.S.C. Chapter 97, if you'd like to read about it. And as far as sovereign immunity goes, liars, will tell you that only governments can have sovereign immunity. This is a fraud, because all governments derive their power from authority delegated from the people, and you can't delegate what you don't have. If the government claims sovereign immunity, then you must have it too. And if they have it and you don't have it, then they have supernatural powers, and we now have a religion problem, and we have a title of nobility. So which is it? What are people called who waive sovereign immunity? Well, they have lots of names. A person who has waived sovereign immunity is called any of the following: a subject, statutory citizen, statutory resident, statutory inhabitant, statutory person, statutory driver under the Vehicle Code, statutory spouse under the Family Code, statutory taxpayer under the Tax Code. And notice we preceded all these terms with statutory. There are actually two contexts. There's statutory and constitutional contexts. You can be a statutory citizen right up here, while at the same time also being a constitutional citizen as well, okay, in the other context. A constitutional citizen is a statutory national, okay? They're not the same thing. A statutory citizen is not the same as a constitutional citizen. The Constitution defines your nationality. The statutes define your domicile. and your statutory status. Completely different. So please don't confuse statutory citizens with constitutional citizens or statutory residents with constitutional residents. They're not the same. As a matter of fact, they're mutually exclusive. And if you don't want to waive sovereign immunity to become unequal or inferior, then you must never describe yourself as any of the above on a government form, and you must never use government property such as statutory public rights that attach to any of the above statuses in the franchises that grant those statuses. So in other words, if you don't want to waive your sovereign immunity in a traffic court, then you shouldn't claim to be a driver, quote unquote. Okay, if you don't want to waive your sovereign immunity in a family court, then you shouldn't call yourself a spouse. You ought to call yourself a non-resident, transient foreigner, or whatever. Okay? That's important. Legal implications of equality and sovereignty. As we described in the first video in this series, equality between you and the government is the foundation of your freedom. And those who are equal to government are called sovereign, just like the government. The only way you can lose your sovereignty under the civil law is to consent to it, as we describe in Requirement for Consent, Form 05.003. The process of consenting to surrender your sovereignty is called waiving sovereign immunity, and waiving sovereign immunity turns private into public property. An example, if you started out as a non-resident and then you filled out a government form declaring yourself to be a citizen, then the status of being a citizen is a public status, and it has public rights attached to it, and it turns you into a public officer. The office itself is called citizen, okay, because the government cannot regulate private rights, so you have to become public before they can regulate you. You have to volunteer to be public. You have to volunteer for an office in the government to be public, and that office is established by a franchise. That's what franchises do, is they create offices. And only by waiving sovereign immunity do you become a statutory person or individual for whom the government can legislate or regulate under the civil statutory law. And whether you're called a person or something else depends on the kind of a franchise. So, for instance, in the vehicle code, a person is called a driver. Okay, in the family code, it's called a spouse. It depends on the context, obviously. Okay, and each one of those franchises is independent of the other, or should be independent of the other. So you can be a driver under the vehicle code and not be a spouse under the family code, and so on. You cannot become a statutory person or citizen or resident until you consent in some way. If the government doesn't procure your consent, they are stealing and exercising unconstitutional eminent domain. The property that they are stealing are the public rights that attach to the status of person or individual. They can't just manufacture rights. They have to come from somewhere. They have to have an origin, and the origin of everything, every power they exercise has to originate from your consent. That's what the Declaration of Independence says. The Constitution is a wall between the public and the private. The Constitution is law created by the people for the government. It's not law for you. It's not law for private people. It's only law for people in the government. It's a delegation of authority order for people in the government. And it constrains only government activities. So if you want to be subject to the Constitution, then you have to volunteer to be part of the government as an officer of the government. So how do governments steal private property? Well, they have to make it public before they can take it, because they can't regulate private rights. And so as we say here, they have to convert private to public, usually without your knowledge, because if you knew that they needed your consent to do the conversion, then you probably wouldn't get it, and they would never be able to do anything, and they would have no power. So they have to hide it. That's how they do it. And they have to bribe you illegally by offering a franchise. They have to surreptitiously make you a public officer, because they can't regulate private people. The U.S. Supreme Court has held that the ability to regulate private conduct is repugnant to the Constitution, for good reason. As a matter of fact, the Constitution itself, the purpose of the Constitution is to protect private rights, and the first step in protecting them is to leave them the hell alone. And they have to play word games to turn citizens or residents into a statutory franchise. So, they could theoretically make citizens and residents private so that they can't regulate them, but then they wouldn't have any power, and since they want the power, then what they did is they made it into a franchise so they can claim the authority to regulate you, but of course they didn't notify you that you had the authority to not participate, and they interfere with efforts to be other than a citizen or a resident and party or customer to their franchise. And here are some other ways that the government steal private property. They have to confuse contexts and definitions of words between statutes and the Constitution. Those two contexts are completely different. For instance, the United States in the United States Constitution geographically means states of the Union and excludes federal territory, whereas the United States in federal law means federal territory and excludes states of the Union. Completely different. And context is everything, and you need to be very aware of the context for every word they use, especially if it has a geographic implication. And they also steal by dumbing you down on law in the public schools. And they also steal private property and convert it to public property by confusing you with untrustworthy publications. You're not allowed, according to the courts, to trust any IRS publication. And so they can say whatever they want in those publications, and in fact they do. And they'll say things that create the appearance that they have authority that in fact they don't have. How executive agencies illegally deny you equality and sovereignty. Without an essential government service, withholding, essentially, an essential government service until you consent to a public status. For instance, a private employer may hand a form to you, a government form for withholding, and tell you that you have to put a Social Security number on there, even though you aren't allowed to use Social Security numbers if you're a private person and if you're not lawfully engaged in a public office. But they'll tell you you have to essentially fill out a particular form, like a W-4 that lies about your status by making you look like a federal employee of the U.S. government. Or they'll force you to put a number on there that implicates you to a public office in the U.S. government, because the regulations say that you're only mandatorily required to provide the number if you're engaged in a public office, which they call a trade or business. So that's how they force a public status on you and basically turn the exercise of a right into a privilege, which is also unconstitutional, and it violates what's called the unconstitutional conditions doctrine. They also illegally deny you equality and sovereignty by limiting entity type choices on forms to remove non-resident and non-person status. For instance, IRS Form W-8, Block 3. The only block they have on that form that would be even close to a human being is a, quote, individual, unquote. But an individual is a public office in the government and also an alien, according to the regulations. And so there is no status you can check in that box as a non-resident human being who is not a public officer. So you have to add your own box, like, for instance, transient foreigner or simply non-resident, non-taxpayer, whichever. And that's true of most government forms, is they'll omit the two most important statuses, which are not subject but not exempt, or non-resident, meaning somebody who's not subject to the civil law, who's not a party to their little club rules. And finally, they'll deny you equality and sovereignty by illegally penalizing non-resident private people with public penalties. An example, IRS penalties only apply to taxpayers, and the courts have repeatedly ruled that they can't declare you a taxpayer. And a taxpayer is legally defined as somebody who's subject. And so if the courts can't declare you a taxpayer, then you're the only one who can. And the courts have also said that they can't do indirectly what they can't do directly. So if they can't directly declare you a taxpayer, they can't presume that you're one. You're the only one who can do that. And the reason is because you're the customer, and the customer's always right. And if you don't want to be a customer, then you just don't call yourself a taxpayer, and you don't fill out taxpayer forms. And there's lots of little tricks like that that you'll learn over time. Franchises are the main method to surrender equality and sovereignty. The main method for procuring your consent to become inferior and unequal and give up your sovereignty is mainly through franchises. And we describe that in great detail, excruciating detail, in Form 05.030 on our website entitled Government Instituted Slavery Using Franchises. And you might ask, well, what the heck is that? Well, everybody knows what the McDonald's franchise or the Burger King franchise is. Well, guess what? Uncle did the same thing. And they have a bunch of separate individual franchises. They have a family code franchise. They have a vehicle code franchise. They have a tax franchise. You know, and the name of the franchisee in each one of those franchises has a different name. You know, in the vehicle code it's called the driver. In the family code it's called the spouse. In the tax code it's called the taxpayer. In the Social Security code it's called the benefit recipient or a person. So they have different names, but they all imply the same thing. And they all imply that you're a customer of the government, that you consented to be a customer, that you want a particular service, and that you're willing to pay for it. And if you accept the benefits of the service but don't want to pay for it, then they'll call you a thief and they'll try to prosecute you. And they'll usually do it criminally. So how do you defend yourself against government administrative claims? And of course, the most famous administrative claims are tax claims. And this little funny poster is here to remind you of just how much cognitive dissonance there is in modern government. Taxes. If politicians told the truth in advertising, it's not theft if you have to fill out a form. And then they penalize you if you don't fill out the form, or if you fill it out in a certain way, or even if you tell the truth on the form. If you define all the terms in such a way that to prove that you're not a subject, then they'll try to penalize you because they're terrorists. It's called paper terrorism. And, you know, ironically, they call people that know the law paper terrorists, and they try to put a label on them like sovereign citizens or some other stupid thing, but they're the real criminals because in our mind there are only two types of governments: government by consent and terrorist government. And if they don't have the burden of proving every time they talk to you that you consented, then they're terrorists. Defending against government administrative claims. If any public servant asserts that they are entitled to your services or property under the civil law, the burden of proof remains on them to produce legal evidence that you consented in writing in a manner that you and not they defined. They also have to prove that you had the legal capacity to consent at the time you consented, and they have to prove that you were either domiciled within the exclusive jurisdiction of that government in question at the time you consented or acted, or that you were representing an entity that was so domiciled under Federal Rule 17b. And if they cannot meet the above burden of proof, they are engaging in a bill of attainder and a violation of the Fifth Amendment Takings Clause. In other words, they're making a claim of public interest in your private property. They're converting private property to a public use and a public purpose without the consent of the owner. That's just a polite way of saying they're stealing. There's no difference between doing that and somebody walking up to you with a gun and saying, "Give me everything." And an example of representing an entity that's domiciled on federal territory would be public officers who represent the government of the United States. The United States is a federal corporation, and they are officers of said corporation, and they are therefore the only persons under the tax code, and they're acting in a representative capacity on behalf of the public trust under Federal Rule 17b. And why do we mention that? Because that's how the tax code works. In fact, all the information returns that get filed against, quote, taxpayers, unquote, are filed against those lawfully engaged in a, quote, trade or business, unquote, which is the functions of a public office, as defined in 26 U.S.C. 7701A26. And why do they have to do that? Because they cannot regulate private conduct. So they have to make you look like something they have jurisdiction over, which is a public officer in the government. And if it was properly presented to you and represented to you, there probably wouldn't be any taxpayers, and most of the people that file tax returns would probably be in jail because they're essentially impersonating a public officer. Defending against government administrative claims. 1. Prevents inequality by ensuring that they expressly reserve all their rights pursuant to UCC, Uniform Commercial Code 1-308, that they expressly refuse to waive sovereign immunity under the long-arm statutes of their state. They do not claim statutory citizen status. Statutory citizens cannot be foreign sovereigns pursuant to 28 U.S.C. 1603b3, and they insist that government can't have sovereign immunity unless they can. We the people cannot delegate an authority to government that they themselves do not also individually possess. And they define all terms on government franchise forms to exclude government civil jurisdiction and withdraw consent to the offer to franchise. That includes tax forms, driver's licensing forms, mayor's licensing, every opportunity to contract with the government, whether it's a license or a franchise or a tax. Every time they talk to you, they have to do it by consent, and they do it surreptitiously by offering a franchise, quote, benefit, unquote, and then not reminding you that it's a contract and that you have a right to not volunteer. And they also deny purposeful availment of any government benefit and classify all payments from the government to be gifts, just like the government does to them. See 31 U.S.C. 321d. And they quit any and every franchise and fill their administrative record with forms necessary to remove consent. And that way they can always defend themselves in a court of law if litigation does ensue. Avoiding loss of equality and sovereignty to franchises. The methods that de facto government abuses to illegally recruit new public officers include all the following. And once again, all franchises require the participants to be public officers. And they enforce the franchises against those who are not public officers and thereby illegally use the franchise mechanisms to create public offices. And examples of that essentially identity theft include all tax forms, which are franchises that implement excise taxes. The activity is called a trade or business. Another type of franchise is all licenses applications, such as mayor's licenses, driver's licenses, professional licenses, and business licenses. Or federal benefit applications, such as Social Security Form SS4 or SS5. All benefits are franchises. Other examples of loss of sovereignty and equality through franchises. Any government form that asks for a Social Security number or taxpayer identification number. 26 CFR 301.62109-1 says these numbers may only be used for those engaged in a trade or business, meaning a public office in the government. If you're not a public officer, you can't use the number lawfully. And as a matter of fact, you're committing a crime if you do. Any form that asks if you are a statutory U.S. citizen or resident, meaning an alien, both of which are privileged franchisees of the United States government. And we prove that in Form 5.006 on our website with a form called Why You Are National, State National, and Constitutional, but Not Statutory Citizen. In short, an SSN or TIN acts as a de facto license to represent a public office in the United States government. Private people cannot lawfully use public identifying numbers without changing their status. It's called impersonating a public officer, and it's a crime. And only those lawfully appointed or elected to public office can participate in franchises. The office has to exist before you sign up for the franchise, not after. You don't create offices with franchises. You add benefits to existing offices. This concludes our treatment of freedom and sovereignty. And as a special treat, we'd like to present to you a short video by Judge Andrew Napolitano of Fox News. And he addresses government and consent of the governed and delegated authority and sovereignty very nicely. And he summarizes basically everything that we've been telling you so far.
Does the government work for us or do we work for the government? Can government create powers on its own, or is it limited only to those powers that we have given to it? Where does the government even come from? Tonight, government, sovereignty, and the consent of the governed. The doctrine of natural rights was most prominently laid out by Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence right at the beginning of the document. We hold these truths to be self-evident, he wrote, that all men are created equal and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is probably the most famous phrase in the English language. But the words that immediately follow may be the most important. Here's what it says. To secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Okay, what is the consent of the governed? Natural rights are inherent to your humanity and the source of your sovereignty as a free individual. If you believe in God as I do and Jefferson did, then you accept the truism that we have been created by him in his image and likeness, and just as he is perfectly free, so are we. If you believe instead that we are the product of natural evolutionary forces and not the intentional recipients of gifts from a loving supreme being, you also recognize that we own our minds and our bodies, and we have the free will to use them as we see fit. Either way, whether you choose theology or biology is the source of our rights. The birth of America in the Declaration of Independence recognized that our rights come from within us. They are not given to us by the government. You have a right to your person, to your property, and to your version of the pursuit of happiness. You also have the right to think as you wish, to say what you think, and to publish what you say. You have the right to use violence to protect yourself from anyone or anything trying to take away your rights. You have the right to privacy, to fairness from the government, the right to travel, to worship or not to worship. You have the right to keep and enjoy your earnings and your property, and you have the right to be left alone. All humans have these rights. But sometimes bad and power-hungry people will try to take these rights away. A thief in the night will use a gun or a crowbar to steal your car. A thief in the government will use the law to steal your income. You get the picture. When the Declaration of Independence talks about government receiving its just powers from the consent of the governed, it is describing the process by which we transfer a portion of our natural rights to the government. The process by which we each give away some of our freedom, some of our individual sovereignty, and thus give to the government its authority to govern. What's important to note about this process is that according to the Declaration of Independence, it is supposed to be voluntary and consensual. That's why government can only wield those powers which the individual is at liberty to wield and to give to the government. Think of it this way. You can't steal a car from your neighbor, and so your friends can't hire an agent to go out and steal from your neighbor either. And thus you and your friends cannot empower the government to do the stealing. Again, I think you get the point. Lawful government only has the powers that we once had and we lawfully gave to the government. Just as slaves have the moral and legal right to leave those enslaving them, just as the states have the moral and legal right to leave a union that violates the Constitution that binds them, so too you have the moral right to live without a government when it breaks its own laws. The federal government claims your consent through the Constitution. The Constitution is a social contract that binds the American people to their government. Did you freely consent to this? I don't know anybody who did. So since none of us consented to the Constitution, either the government stays within the confines of the Constitution, or we can ignore or change the government. This view, called the consent of the governed, was widely and openly accepted by the framers. They gave us a Constitution which defines limits and constrains the government. This is why adherence to the Constitution by all government is so crucial to preserving and retaining our freedoms. The Constitution formalizes the relationship between sovereign people and sovereign states and the federal government. When the Constitution is ignored, so is our sovereignty. And if we can't avoid a government to which we never gave consent and which violates the Constitutions, so will our freedoms be ignored. That's why we defend freedom here every night of the week.
That was a great speech by Judge Napolitano, wasn't it? We'd like to say a few words about that speech. The right to live without government is something he referred to. He said that you have a right to live without government. The type of government he was referring to is the civil government, not the criminal government. The criminal laws do not require your consent to enforce, but the civil laws do. Note that the judge also said that slaves have a right to escape slavery, This implies that if your government enslaves you, then you can and should leave it. Secondly, he also said that states have a right to leave a union that binds them to an abusive or criminal national government. And finally, he said that you have a right to leave a government when it breaks its own laws. In the context of you leaving the government, as he indicated, and refusing to be civilly governed, doing so only when it breaks its own laws is not the only legitimate or valid reason. Other additional, important, and equally valid reasons include if it violates God's laws, because our allegiance should be to God, and that allegiance should be supreme over any man or government of men. Secondly, we may want to leave that government because the costs of participating outweigh the, quote, benefits, unquote, because the government has gotten too much into debt, as the present government has. Another reason might include that the laws it passes are simply unjust from a moral perspective if we aren't believers in God, because he did refer to secular people who don't believe in God. And fourth, if the government refuses to recognize and enforce the requirement for consent in everything civil that it does. A government that civilly rules without consent is a terrorist government. And we should always avoid and refuse to subsidize any terrorist. As a matter of fact, it's a crime to subsidize terrorism. The Declaration of Independence also makes it your duty to leave any government that refuses to do the only job it was created to do, which is to protect your private rights. And here's what Thomas Jefferson said in that declaration. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and remember the pursuit of happiness is what we call the right to own property, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. And the implication here is that anything that does not derive from consent is unjust. And if it's unjust, as we just described, here's what we're supposed to do. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter and abolish it, and to institute new, that is, self-government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. So no one can interfere with the exercise of that right to leave the government. The right to live without government, as Judge Napolitano said, the right to be without a civil government, and by civil government we really mean statutory civil government. We don't advance that people should avoid the common law. We simply say they should not be subject to the statutory law, because that law can and does regulate only the conduct of government employees and public officers. Any attempt to regulate anyone else is slavery and theft. So, here's where that right to be without a civil statutory government originates. Your First Amendment right to not associate with a group called government. You don't need to be a member of the club called a statutory citizen to have this right. Because remember, constitutional rights attach to the land. They don't attach to your status. So even if you aren't a citizen, you can still use them in court in your defense. Being forced to join or to be held liable for the, quote, club rules, unquote, called civil statutory law is called compelled association, and it's a violation of the First Amendment and a tort, a constitutional tort. Secondly, the right to live without a civil statutory government is your right to contract or not contract. Governments are created to protect your right to contract. No one, including governments, can compel you to contract with any group, including any government, or to become a party to the social compact or contract called a statutory citizen or resident. So that's the second origin of your right to be without a civil statutory government. The third origin is the legal definition of justice, which is the right to be left alone. And finally, the last origin of your right to be without a civil statutory government is the purpose of government itself, identified by the Founding Fathers, which is protecting your right to be left alone by everyone, including them. And here's the legal definition of justice to prove what we're saying. Paulson Ethics, and this comes from Readings on the History and System of Common Law, 2nd edition, 1925, Roscoe Pound. Justice, as a moral habit, is that tendency of the will and mode of conduct which refrains from disturbing the lives and interests of others, and as far as possible hinders such interference on the part of others. And by others, they can only mean everyone, because Obama said all are equal. So they must be referring to both citizens and residents who are members of the club, and also the club facilitators, which are the government. This virtue springs from the individual's respect for his fellows as ends in themselves and as his co-equals. There's that equality thing again. The different spheres of interest may be roughly classified as follows: body and life, the family or the extended individual life, property or the totality of instruments of action, honor or the ideal existence, and finally freedom or the possibility of fashioning one's life as an end in itself. The law defends these different spheres, thus giving rise to corresponding number of spheres of rights, each being protected by a prohibition. To violate the rights, to interfere with the interests of others, is injustice. All injustice is ultimately directed against the life of the neighbor. It is an open avowal that the latter is not an end in itself, having the same value as the individual's own life. There's that equality thing again, same value. The general formula of the duty of justice may therefore be stated as follows: do no wrong to yourself, do no wrong yourself, and permit no wrong to be done so far as lies in your power, or, expressed positively, respect and protect the right. And that is why governments are created. That is what justice means in a court of law. That is what being a justice or a judge means in the court of law. And here are some authorities on the right to be left alone. The first one is from the Founding Fathers themselves in Federalist Paper number 51. And they defined government as follows: justice is the end of government. It is the end of civil society. It ever has been and ever will be pursued until it be obtained, or until liberty be lost in its pursuit. So the very purpose of government itself is justice. And we just showed you what that definition of justice is. It means the right to be left alone by everyone, including the government. And the Supreme Court recognized this requirement also in the case of Olmstead versus United States. Justice Brandeis, 1928, quote, "The makers of our Constitution undertook to secure conditions favorable to the pursuit of happiness. They recognized the significance of man's spiritual nature, of his feelings, and of his intellect. They knew that only a part of the pain, pleasure, and satisfactions of life are to be found in material things. They sought to protect Americans in their beliefs, their thoughts, their emotions, and their sensations. They conferred as against the government the right to be let alone, the most comprehensive of rights, and the right most valued by civilized men." So the very basis of the civil law is to protect your right to be left alone. And that's what a civilized man wants, is simply to be left alone. And here is what American Jurisprudence 2D, Constitutional Legal Encyclopedia, says under the subject of constitutional law, forced and prohibited associations. And the subject of this section is the First Amendment that we just talked about earlier, where you have a right to not participate in the club. Quote, "The Supreme Court has made it clear that compelling an individual to become a member of an organization with political aspects," and by the way, governments always have political aspects. Two of the three branches in governments are political branches. The legislative branch and the executive branch are political branches. Moving on, "or compelling an individual to become a member of an organization which financially supports, in more than an insignificant way, political personages or goals which the individual does not wish to support, is an infringement of the individual's constitutional right to freedom of association. The First Amendment prevents the government, except in the most compelling circumstances, from wielding its power to interfere with its employees' freedom to believe and associate, or to not believe and not associate. It is not merely a tenure provision that protects public employees from actual or constructive discharge. Refusing to be civilly governed is not anarchy. Repeat, is not anarchy. Sometimes corrupt public servants intending to intimidate and terrorize you may call those who refuse to be civilly governed by the civil statutory law as, quote, anarchists, unquote. And of course, they try to color that word anarchist with violence. And we are not a violent organization. We don't advocate any sort of violence or terrorism. Nevertheless, this allegation is false and fraudulent because, number one, an anarchist is one who has no law and is therefore lawless. That's the legal definition. Since they don't need your consent to enforce the criminal law, then you are not lawless. You are subject to the criminal laws, whether you want to be or not. Number three, you can and should still govern your life civilly under God's laws, even if you refuse to be the subject of the government's civil statutory laws. And we are a religious ministry, and that's what we tell people who join us, is they should never intend to escape the obligations of the law, because the purpose of the law is to love your neighbor and to prevent your neighbor from being harmed. And there are only two commandments given by Jesus: love your God and love your neighbor. And you don't hurt people you love. So we don't suggest that people should not obey some civil authority. We just don't want it to be unjust civil authorities. And lastly, even those who are not subject to the civil statutory law are still subject to the common law as non-residents. Hence, they can still be governed only by the courts and only when they injure a fellow equal sovereign neighbor. Hence, they are not even lawless from a civil perspective. Enforcement of the civil statutory law is only a subset of what civil courts are permitted to do. So that pretty much summarizes our treatment and our commentary on what Judge Napolitano said, so that we can integrate it in with the remainder of this presentation. This concludes our presentation. Further information on the subject we covered are found in these documents on our website. Requirement for consent, Form 5.003, which provides detailed treatment on the requirement that you consent to everything the government does, and Citizenship and Sovereignty course, Form 12.001, which talks more about sovereignty and citizenship and the two contexts for citizenship, statutory and constitutional, which we just described, and our Government Franchises course, Form 12.012, which provides an overview of franchises and franchise courts. And finally, Government Instituted Slavery Using Franchises, Form 5.030. This shows you how franchises are illegally enforced outside of the territory of the sovereign to enslave and invade foreign jurisdictions. There's no difference between offering a franchise in a state that's only intended for federal territory and invading Iraq. It's the same thing. And by the way, it's unconstitutional under Article 4, Section 4. Invasions of by the federal government of the states is unconstitutional. And that's what they are. So this concludes our presentation, and we hope you visit our website and look at some of our other materials. Thanks for watching.